Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's return to politics and Brexit now, and the possibility of a no-deal Brexit is not going away, with both candidates for the Tory leadership saying they would be prepared to take Britain out of the EU without a withdrawal agreement at all. But what is the reality of a no-deal Brexit, or even a so-called managed no deal? Well, joining me now is Martin Howe, QC, an expert on the EU constitution and a member of the Brexit supporting group Economists for Free Trade, and Professor Alan Winters, a former chief economist at the Department of International Development. Thank you both for joining us. This is becoming the sort of issue of the moment. Can I ask you both, first of all, do you accept that a no deal, a pure no deal, coming out on October 31st without one would be very costly for the economy? Martin Howe first.
Well, first of all, I'm not an economist. I am a lawyer. But I don't accept that because it depends on what arrangements are in place and how we carry on trading with the European Union after we leave. Also, we have to be very careful about using terminology here, because people use no deal in all sorts of different ways. And actually, there isn't going to be absolutely no deal at all, if you see what I mean, under any circumstances, because a lot of these standard relationships between independent states will carry on between the European Union and us, regardless of whether or not we have some special trade agreement or other agreement with them. Right.
Professor Winters, do you agree with that? I mean, if we come out, as is, we've legislated to come out October 31st, will there be some sort of agreements in place, or are we just out on no deal?
There will be a number of agreements of sort of international trade nature globally. We'll be members of the World Trade Organization and so on. There might be a couple of temporary deals to keep the planes flying and things like that. But for basic trade, selling stuff and buying stuff, we will be treated by the European Union as a third country. They'll levy tariffs on us. They will inspect our goods and our services to make sure that they satisfy European standards, European requirements. All of that is additional cost to British traders, and that will get passed on to you and me.
Right. And so, Martin, how do you accept that? I mean, I think, or are you talking about a sort of an agreement under the GATT, Article 24 of GATT, where, they could do a deal with the EU, a sort of temporary deal with the EU?
Well, that is certainly one possibility. You see, I think a lot of confusion arises because people use the words no deal to talk about a situation where we don't have an agreement to withdraw from the European Union under Article 50 of the treaty, which is what everyone has been talking about for the last 2 years. But we don't actually need such an agreement in order to withdraw. And the agreement negotiated by Theresa May has a number of very negative features. The European Union have said they will not be prepared to renegotiate it. So one possibility is that that's just left behind. It's never concluded. But it doesn't mean then that we necessarily exit the European Union with having absolutely no deal with them about our future relationship with them. Because the biggest card we have to play is that we are their best customer. We have a massive deficit in goods trade. In other words, we buy far more goods from them than they buy from us. And what's more, their goods tend to be heavily concentrated in sectors where they have very high tariffs, agriculture, motor cars, and textiles. So it's actually very much in the interest of the European Union to preserve smooth trade, particularly in the flow of goods, regardless of whether or not there's a withdrawal agreement.
Professor Winters, do you go along with that?
No, absolutely not, I'm afraid. I mean, we have a withdrawal agreement that has to satisfy 3 broad areas, citizens' rights, Northern Ireland, and the budget. We walk away from that, and then we turn up and say to the EU, why don't you give us the best trade deal you've ever signed, which still won't be like being inside the European Union. What are they going to say? It is absolutely true that sovereign countries, sovereign blocs like the EU and the UK can sign trade deals. But the idea that when we withdraw with no arrangement such as the withdrawal agreement at all, they will fall over and give us a trade deal is just for the birds.
Yeah, I mean, he's right, isn't he, Martin Howe? I mean, it would be, A, it would be setting a, well, A, it would be setting a precedent. B, we'd be walking away from this, 500 pages agreement that is on the table. We'd be giving up freedom of movement. Under Boris Johnson, we may not even be paying some of the 39 billion back. Why would they jump at an opportunity to do a deal with us?
Well, let's just look at these points. First of all, citizens' rights. The UK government has already offered, both unilaterally to guarantee EU citizens' rights as set out in the withdrawal agreement, and, if necessary, to enter into a separate treaty to guarantee them, so they'd be mutually guaranteed.
That's not freedom of movement and, 39 billion, is it?
Nobody's talking about continuation of freedom of movement. That's out of the window. What we're talking about is guaranteeing the rights of EU citizens who are resident here and of UK citizens who are resident in EU member states. And that's what's in the withdrawal agreement. Now that can be put into a separate agreement. The other factor, the money, my view is that we ought to pay what we owe under international law. I think that's a great deal less than the withdrawal agreement would make us pay. But we could sensibly offer to submit to an international arbitration so that can rule on who's right or wrong on this.
Okay.
The Northern Ireland border, I mean, it is completely senseless to discuss the Northern Ireland border except in the context of a future trade relationship. I mean, it's this mad idea of trying to work out what to do with the border in advance of actually how we will trade and what our customs processes will be between us and the EU.
But there's no real answer to the border question. I mean, Professor Winters, I'll bring you back in. What do you make of what you're hearing?
I have to say, I just think that this is castles in the air. We have negotiated for 3 years. We've come to an agreement, actually, and now we find it difficult to stand by that agreement. If we withdraw without that withdrawal agreement, the EU is going to be very difficult. I think it's certainly true. They might eventually agree something about citizens' rights. They will have 6 or 9 months sort of temporary agreements to help the planes fly and things like that. But the idea that they will cooperate in keeping our trade flowing, keep recognizing our qualifications and that sort of thing, it frankly is just entirely unreasonable. So if we behave in that sort of way, we have to accept that there will be very heavy costs imposed on all our trade with the European Union. Trade will not stop, that's for sure, but it will be seriously reduced. Livelihood to be put at stake, things won't be available to them.
Right, Martin Howe, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, we have not concluded an agreement with the European Union. We absolutely have not. What happened is Theresa May...
Well, there is one. It's on the table. It's still on the table. It's there.
No,
a withdrawal agreement.
We have not concluded that agreement. We have not concluded it. It is always subject to ratification by our Parliament, which has rejected it 3 times, and by the European Parliament, which has never had it put in front of it. Right. It is not a concluded agreement.
Let me put one other point to you. Article 24, Martin, let me put you another point. Article 24, which Boris Johnson's talking about, I understand that only covers goods. What about services, which are, I think, something like 40 or 45% of our exports?
Well, absolutely. The GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, relates to goods, and Article 24 specifically relates just to one aspect of goods trades, which is tariffs. There are other aspects of our trade between us and the European Union, which are both goods and services, which generally relate to mutual recognition of standards. And those indeed are arrangements that it would be sensible to have and which would be very much in the European Union's interest to have as part of a deal when we leave the European Union.
Okay, let me
the reason...
Look, we've only got 30 seconds left. Let me just give a final word to Professor Winters. Thanks.
Martin is correct that we have not concluded the agreement. We've got to the point where we say we will try and ratify it. If we renege on that, if we pull back from that, the European Union is not going to be very cooperative. Martin is exactly right. 45% of our exports are services. We will lose a great deal of access. The government admits this, even under the withdrawal agreement, let alone no deal. So the costs of coming back from where we are at and having no deal at all apart from these temporary things will be very high. And it will come and hit not only business, but also, of course, consumers and public finance. It's an extremely risky game.
OK, Professor Winters and Martin Howe, I appreciate your time, both of you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.